Paulette Hébert had $23.17 in her checking account the morning her daughter called to say she'd passed her nursing exam. Not 23/7 after the hydro bill, not 23/7 after groceries. 23/7 before any of it. That was rent week, gas money, and the prescription refill for her blood pressure medication, all living inside the same number, on the same Tuesday in February, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Rue des Érables in Moncton, New Brunswick, while outside the temperature had dropped to -19, and the radiator in the living room was doing the thing it always did in deep cold, which was make noise without producing heat. Her daughter's name was Océane. She had just turned 26. She had been studying for 4 years, working weekend shifts at a long-term care facility on the north end of the city to pay for books and transit, and the kind of quiet she needed to study, which meant earbuds in a public library until 10 p.m., because the apartment walls were thin and the neighbors on the left had a newborn. When Paulette picked up the phone and heard Océane's voice, high, cracked, laughing and crying at the same time in the way that only happens when something you have worked toward for years finally becomes real, she sat down on the edge of her bed and pressed her free hand flat against her knee to keep it from shaking. She said, "Tell me." Océane said, "I passed, Maman, I passed." Paulette said, "I know you did." She had not known, she had hoped. Those are different things, though she had spent the last 4 years making sure Océane could not tell them apart. 3 weeks earlier, Paulette Hébert had been standing in the cereal aisle at the Metro on Mountain Road, with a box of oats in one hand and her phone calculator open in the other. She was doing the math the way she always did it, quietly, without moving her lips, adding up what was in the cart and subtracting from what was in the account, and trying to land on a number that did not require putting something back. The oats were $4.89. She put them in the cart. She put back the orange juice. She was 53 years old. She had worked the front desk at Clinique Beausoleil for 11 years, answering phones and scheduling appointments and translating between the francophone patients and the 2 English-speaking dermatologists, who had never quite gotten around to learning enough French to manage on their own. She made $19.40 an hour. She worked 32 hours a week because 32 hours was the number below which the clinic did not have to provide benefits, and the clinic had not provided benefits in 11 years, which Paulette had understood when she took the job and had simply stopped thinking about, because thinking about it did not change it. Her husband, René Hébert, had left 8 years ago. Not dramatically. He had not been cruel or loud about it. He had simply become someone who was increasingly absent and then, one April, entirely absent. He moved to Alberta for work, sent money for the first 2 years, and then sent less, and then sent a message saying he was sorry. Things were tight. And Paulette had read that message sitting at the same kitchen table where Océane was doing her grade 12 homework, and she had put the phone face down and said, "Do you want pasta or rice tonight?" Océane had said, "Rice." Paulette had made rice. She did not tell Océane about the message until 6 months later. By then, Océane had already noticed what was missing from the account, because she had seen her mother standing in the kitchen at midnight with a notepad and a pen, writing numbers in columns the way she always did when the columns were not cooperating. She was 16 then. She did not ask about the numbers. She started taking on extra babysitting shifts for the family across the street, the Gagnon family, 2 boys under 5 and a mother who worked evenings at the hospital. Océane came home at 11 on Fridays, smelling like macaroni and crayon wax, and she put the money in a jar on the kitchen shelf without saying what it was for. Paulette saw the jar. She did not touch it. She did not say anything about it. Some things do not need to be said to be understood. By the time Océane graduated high school, the jar had $340 in it. She used it for her nursing school application fees and her textbooks for the first semester. Paulette drove her to campus on the first day. The car was a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heat dial that only worked if you pushed it in while turning it, which Paulette had learned to do without thinking. She parked in the visitor lot. She turned off the engine. They sat for a moment. Ocean said, "You don't have to walk me in." Paulette said, "I know." She walked her in anyway. The nursing program at the Université de Moncton was 4 years. Clinical placements in the 3rd and 4th year meant Ocean needed a car some mornings, which meant borrowing Paulette's, which meant Paulette took the bus on those days, which meant she left the apartment at 6:40 instead of 7:50, and arrived at the clinic 40 minutes before. Her shift started and sat in the waiting room, reading her phone until the receptionist she was replacing went home. She did not mention this to Ocean. Ocean found out anyway. She found out because she saw the bus schedule pinned to the fridge one morning behind the grocery list, and she asked about it, and Paulette said the car had been making a sound and she wanted to get it checked before driving it, which was partially true. It did make a sound. It made several sounds, all of which Paulette had been monitoring and deciding were probably fine for another month or so. Ocean looked at her mother for a long moment. Paulette was already putting her coat on. Ocean said, "Mayman." Paulette said, "The 7:10 doesn't wait." She went out the door. There was a woman at the clinic named Hélène Bourgeois who managed the billing side. She was 61, sharp, the kind of woman who noticed things without drawing attention to the fact that she'd noticed them. She and Paulette had worked side by side for 9 years. They took their lunch breaks at the same time most days, in the small staff room with the laminate table and the window that looked out onto the parking structure, eating whatever they had brought from home and talking about things that were not work. One afternoon in November, Hélène set down her container of leftover soup and looked at Paulette directly. She said, "You look tired." Paulette said, "I'm fine." Hélène said, "I didn't say you weren't fine, I said you look tired." Paulette ate her sandwich. She said, "Ocean has her final placement evaluation next week." Hélène said, "And you're not sleeping." Paulette said, "I sleep." Hélène said, "Paulette." Paulette looked out at the parking structure. She said, "She's worked so hard, 4 years. I want it to go well for her." Hélène was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You've been running on fumes since Renée left. Maybe longer than that. You know that, right?" Paulette didn't answer. Hélène said, "You're allowed to be exhausted. That's not a failure. That's just what it costs." They went back to work. Paulette did not bring it up again, but she thought about the word costs. She turned it over on the bus ride home. What it costs. She had never thought about it that way, as a transaction with a price. She had just thought about it as the next thing, and the next thing after that, and the thing after that, moving through the weeks the way you move through deep snow, not fast, not elegantly, just forward. The apartment cost $150 a month. Her take-home was $2,280. After rent, groceries, hydro, internet, which she kept because Ocean needed it for her coursework, and her prescription, which was $47 a month and which she sometimes delayed by a week when the timing was tight, there was usually somewhere between $40 and $80 remaining. Some months less. She had not bought herself new boots in 3 winters. The pair she was wearing had a separation along the left sole that let in water when she stepped in slush, which in Moncton in February was unavoidable. She had bought waterproofing spray and applied it twice. It helped until it didn't. She walked slightly differently now on wet days, favoring the right foot, redistributing the weight so the left sole lifted less. She had not told Ocean about the boots. Ocean found out because she saw her mother's socks on the bathroom mat one evening. After Paulette had come in from a wet commute, gray wool socks darkened from the ankle down, and she had picked them up to put them in the wash and held them for a moment. And not said anything. That was in January, 6 weeks before the phone call. The nursing licensing exam was on a Thursday. Océane drove to the exam center at 7:30. She had studied for 6 weeks with a kind of focused ferocity that Paulette recognized, because it was the same ferocity Océane had applied to everything, since she was old enough to understand that getting somewhere was going to require more effort from her than from some other people. And she had decided early that this was not a complaint. It was just the situation, and the situation was workable. Paulette worked her full shift that day. She answered phones. She rescheduled a Tuesday canceled appointment. She told a patient the dermatologist was running 15 minutes behind and offered them a water from the cooler near the desk. She did all of this on 4 hours of sleep. At 2:15 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen. It was a message from Océane, 3 words. "It's done. Waiting." Paulette turned her phone over. She helped the next patient check in. She did not look at her phone again until her break. At 4:47, her phone rang. She picked up. She heard Océane's voice. She sat down. She said, "I know you did." She did not cry at work. She went to the staff bathroom after, ran cold water over her wrists the way she did when she needed to slow something down, and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. 53 years old. Gray coming in at the temples. The lines around her eyes that had deepened in the last 3 years from squinting at the computer screen because she needed reading glasses and had kept putting off the eye appointment. She looked at herself and thought, she did it. Not I helped, Océane did it. But that evening when she got home, she found a card propped against the salt shaker on the kitchen table. White envelope. Her name on the front in Océane's handwriting. She stood in her coat for a moment looking at it. She took her coat off. She sat down. She opened it. Inside the card, Océane had written something. Not long, not elaborate, just 2 sentences in the careful, slightly right-leaning handwriting she had had since grade 3. "You took the bus in the dark every winter morning so I could sleep another hour. I have never forgotten a single one." Paulette read it. She read it again. She put it down on the table. She got up and stood at the kitchen window looking at the street. The snow had started again, small dry flakes coming sideways in the wind, the way they did when the temperature dropped below -15. The streetlight at the corner was on. A car moved past slowly. She stood there for a long time. She was not crying. She was doing something else, something that did not have a clean word for it. The thing that happens when you realize that someone has been watching you more carefully than you knew, and has been carrying that watching inside them for years without telling you. And now they have put it in 2 sentences, and you are holding those sentences in your hands, and they weigh more than they should. She thought about the mornings, the 6:40 bus, standing at the stop in the dark in January with the left boot slowly taking on water. The fluorescent light inside the clinic waiting room where she sat for 40 minutes, reading nothing on her phone. She had not thought of those mornings as sacrifices when she was living them. They had just been mornings. The next thing that needed to happen. But Océane had known. Paulette went back to the table. She sat down. She picked up the card and read the 2 sentences again. She thought about her own mother, Monique, who had died 11 years ago, and who had worked the lunch counter at a department store in Dieppe for 22 years, so that Paulette and her brother could go on school trips and have winter coats that fit, and not have to think about whether they could afford school trips or winter coats. Monique had never talked about money. She had talked about other things: the weather, the neighbors, what was on television, whether Paulette was eating enough. The money had just been managed, quietly, in the background, the way the heat is managed, or the water pressure is managed, invisibly, by someone who has made it their job to make it invisible. Paulette had never told her mother that she noticed. She had meant to. There had been time, right up until there wasn't. 11 years ago, a stroke, fast, and then a week in hospital, and then the kind of silence that does not fill back in. She had not told her. She held Ocean's card. The next morning, Ocean came home from her friend Brigitte's apartment, where she had been celebrating the night before with a small group from the program, 4 people and a bottle of sparkling wine bought specifically for the occasion. She came in at 9 a.m., still in her coat, cheeks red from the cold. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Paulette was already dressed. Coffee made. The card was propped back against the salt shaker where she had put it the night before. Ocean looked at the card. She looked at her mother. Paulette said, "Sit down." Ocean sat. Paulette poured her a coffee. She set it in front of her. Then she sat across from her and put her hands around her own cup and looked at her daughter. She said, "I need to tell you something." Ocean waited. Paulette said, "Your grandmother, my mother, I never told her." Said, "Told her what?" Paulette said, "That I saw, what she did, how hard she worked. I saw it and I never said it out loud to her. Not once. I thought I had time." She paused. "I didn't have time." The kitchen was quiet. Outside the snow had stopped. The light was the pale, flat kind that comes after a snowfall when the clouds haven't cleared yet. Paulette said, "I read your card about 15 times last night." Ocean said, "Maimon." Paulette said, "Let me finish." She looked at her coffee. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to know that what you wrote, those 2 sentences, that is the most important thing anyone has said to me in a very long time, and I don't want to wait 11 years and then not have time." Ocean was looking at her. Her eyes were doing the thing they had done on the phone yesterday, filling up before she was ready for them to. Paulette said, "I am proud of you in a way I don't have words for. Not because you passed, because of who you are while you were passing. The whole time, all 4 years." Ocean reached across the table and put her hand over her mother's. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ocean said, "The boots." Paulette said, "What?" Ocean said, "I've been looking at them all winter. The left one." Paulette said, "They're fine." Ocean said, "Maman, they are not fine." Paulette started to say something else, and then stopped, because Ocean was already getting up and going to the front closet, and she came back with a white plastic bag that she set on the table between them. Paulette looked at it. Ocean said, "I bought them 3 weeks ago. I was waiting for the right time, and then I realized I was doing what you do, which is wait until everything is perfect, and nothing is ever perfect, so." Paulette opened the bag. Inside was a pair of winter boots, dark brown, mid-calf lined. Practical, not decorative, the kind of boot a person wears in Moncton in February, because Moncton in February requires a boot you can rely on. She held one in both hands. She said, "Ocean, these are too expensive." Ocean said, "I got them on sale." Paulette looked at her. Ocean said, "Okay, they were not that on sale. But I have my first shift at the hospital starting in 3 weeks, and I need you to have boots that work so I don't spend the whole shift thinking about your socks." Paulette set the boot down on the table. She looked at her daughter. 26 years old, coat still on, coffee going cold, eyes red from yesterday and probably from last night, sitting in this kitchen the same way she had sat in this kitchen, doing homework and counting money in a jar, and saying rice when asked rice or pasta. Paulette said, "You didn't have to do that." Ocean said, "I know." A pause. Ocean said, "Neither did you, any of it." The apartment was quiet. The radiator in the living room was making its noise. Somewhere outside, someone's car was not starting, the particular grinding sound of a cold engine in February, and then it caught, and then there was just the street. Paulette picked up her coffee cup. Océane picked up hers. They sat at the table in the pale winter light and drank their coffee and did not say anything for a while. And the quiet between them was not empty. It was the kind of quiet that has a lot inside it, years of it, the 6.40 bus and the jar on the shelf and the card propped against the salt shaker, and 2 sentences in right-leaning handwriting that had been written and rewritten until they were exactly right. Outside, the clouds shifted and the light changed, and for a moment the kitchen was brighter than it had been. The kind of brightness that only comes in winter after a snowfall, when the sky finally clears and the light comes back sharper and cleaner and more than you were expecting. Hélène noticed something the following Monday. She noticed it before Paulette had taken her coat off. She noticed it because she was the kind of person who noticed things. She said, "New boots." Paulette hung up her coat. She said, "My daughter bought them." Hélène looked at her, not at the boots, at her face. She said, "How are you?" Paulette said, "I'm okay." She paused. She said it again differently. "I'm okay." Hélène nodded slowly. She had known Paulette for 9 years. She could tell the difference. She said, "Good. Now say it like you've got the boots to prove it." Paulette laughed. It came out quick and genuine, the kind that doesn't announce itself. She sat down at the desk. She answered the first call of the morning. Outside, through the clinic window, Moncton was doing what Moncton did in February. Gray sky, traffic moving carefully, people walking with their heads down against the wind. A normal Tuesday. The same as every Tuesday. Except that on the shelf above her monitor, Paulette had propped a small white card. 2 sentences in her daughter's handwriting. She had laminated it the night before with the laminator at the pharmacy on St. George Street, the one you could use for $2, because she wanted it to last. She glanced at it once before the next call came in. Then she picked up the phone. Some things you carry for years without knowing anyone sees the weight. And then, one day someone hands you 2 sentences, and you understand that they have been watching the whole time, holding what they saw, waiting until the words were ready. Some things you do not get to say to the people who needed to hear them. Some things arrive just in time. The card is still there. The boots still fit. The 6:40 bus runs every morning, though Paulette no longer has to take it alone in the dark. Her daughter calls on Sundays now from her apartment 2 kilometers away, the one she moved into last spring with a roommate from the hospital floor, and they talk for 20 minutes about things that are not hard, because the hard things have already been said, and said well, and do not need repeating. That is enough, more than enough. That is in fact everything. I think about Paulette standing at that bus stop at 6:40 in the morning, left boot slowly taking on water, and I think about how she never once described that as a sacrifice. It was just the next thing. The thing that needed to happen so the thing after it could happen too. That's something I've noticed about people who carry a lot quietly. They don't have a word for what they're doing because they're too busy doing it. They're not performing strength. They're just moving through the day with whatever they have, trying to make sure the people they love don't feel the weight of what's being held. Paulette did that for 4 years. She rearranged her mornings, her budget, her boots, her sleep, and she never asked Océane to notice. But Océane noticed anyway. That's the part that stays with me. Children see more than we give them credit for. They see the socks on the bathroom mat. They see the calculator open in the grocery aisle. They see which parent leaves before the sun comes up, and which one is still making breakfast when they get home. They don't always say so, but they are watching, and they are storing what they see, and at some point, if we are lucky, they put it into words. 2 sentences. That's all it took to unlock something Paulette had been holding in place for years. Not with drama, not with a grand gesture. Just the truth, written in right-leaning handwriting on a folded card, propped against a salt shaker. You took the bus in the dark every winter morning so I could sleep another hour. I have never forgotten a single one. What Paulette built in those 4 years wasn't just financial survival. It was a kind of integrity, the decision to show up the same way every single day, whether or not anyone was keeping score. That's the thing about doing right by someone in private. It costs something real. It requires you to hold your own discomfort quietly and keep going anyway. That's not just love. That is a form of character that I think is genuinely rare. And Océane carries it, too. You can see it in the way she handled the boots, buying them 3 weeks early, waiting for the right moment, then deciding that waiting for the perfect moment is another way of not doing the thing at all. She had watched her mother long enough to understand that. Watching Paulette had taught her something that no classroom teaches directly. That wisdom isn't knowing the right answer. It's knowing when to act on it. What I keep coming back to is the conversation Paulette had at the kitchen table, the one where she told Océane about her own mother, about the 11 years she didn't say what she saw, about running out of time. That took courage of a different kind, not the courage of endurance, but the courage of honesty, the willingness to be specific about what you got wrong and why it mattered. That kind of conversation is what closes the gap between people. Not the big declarations, the honest, quiet ones. I don't think we talk enough about what it looks like to raise someone well without much to work with. We celebrate the outcome and forget the mornings. We see the nursing certificate and not the wet sock on the bathroom mat. Paulette's story doesn't end with wealth or recognition. It ends with a card on the fridge and boots that fit and a daughter who calls on Sundays. That's it. And somehow that's the whole thing. Some of us have a Paulette in our own life. Someone who rearranged something, their time, their sleep, their comfort, so we could have a little more of ours. If you haven't said it yet, say it. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Océane didn't, and it was enough. More than enough.